Most of the people know me. I'm Chelsea. I'm a fractional chief growth officer. I help agencies and B2B service based businesses scale and grow their companies. And then, Saeed, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Saieed. I've been dealing with leadership development for the past 10 years. My background started in a contact center environment. It ended in a corporate sense where I was director of sales operations in a wholesale operations company. And then I moved into management consultancy and leadership coaching, which is what I've been doing. And my current mission is I help leaders harmonize their work and lives through leadership development, personalized coaching, and personal development coaching as well.
Awesome. Do you find a lot of leaders are not in balance right now?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's either end of the spectrum, really. It's either for new managers or first-time managers who suddenly are faced with the responsibility and accountability, which they're not used to, or they've not been developed properly, or they've been promoted through various sort of reasons apart from what's really required from leaders. And that ends up with significant amounts of pressure on them, on their shoulders, being tasked with managing a team all of a sudden. It does sort of typically start to affect their well-being, both in professional and personal capacities. And then the end result is normally sort of burnout and seeking support for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you'd like, you could share your own experience with burnout because we actually connected due to a post you shared about how you experienced burnout and then you went to rehab for it, some type of rehab. So I think the
Yeah.
audience would really benefit from hearing your experience.
Yeah, it's a story I share often. It's basically I just want to, before I do that, I just want to read a bit of a disclaimer out, if that's
Oh, yeah,
okay.
forgot about that.
That's fine. Because we're talking about burnout, and although burnout itself is classed as an occupational hazard predominantly, it sort of means that whilst we'll be sort of sharing personal stories and our journey and insights, it's not to be mistaken for the sort of advice that you can get from counseling, which is what a lot of individuals end up having to do, such as myself. So it's essential that whilst we share our journey and talk about backgrounds and some of the reasons and the underlying reasons behind burnout, it's certainly not to sort of victimize anyone. And it's more to sort of foster an understanding, and it's essential that you exercise discernment, basically. And so let's embark on this journey together with open hearts and open minds. So that's the disclaimer piece. Going into my personal experience with burnout, it's complex in the sense that whilst there are lots of visible symptoms, or let's say physical and non-physical symptoms of burnout, there's usually an underlying cause to that, or various underlying causes. For me, it was more of a childhood experience where my regimented upbringing put me in a mental state of having to achieve and having to overachieve, having to achieve X, Y, and Z before I was taken seriously. That was something that was drilled into me as a child. And as I grew up, it sort of snowballed into areas such as perfectionism and people-pleasing tendencies. So I fast-tracked my way into a professional career where I started as a salesperson on the phones in a contact center environment. I was classed as a high-performing salesperson. The next sort of progression to that was automatically becoming a manager. Not to say I wasn't ready for that, because I felt in myself that I was ready. Of course, I felt that way. But I wasn't really prepared for it in the way that I should have been. So I was promoted to manager when I was 19. I failed epically, and I often share the story around that. Fast forward sort of 5.5 years, I became director of sales operations at the age of, I think it was 24, 25, so 5.5 years, 6 years. So what was happening behind the scenes and in the background was a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, a lot of misalignment. The fact that I wasn't looking after myself, I wasn't taking care of my well-being. Everything sort of became work, work, work. I come from a family of overachievers, of workaholics, and that was sort of the rule book that I used in my career as well. And the ultimate result of that was I reached a stage where I wasn't eating, I wasn't sleeping. There was a lot of fatigue. There was a lot of irritability, aggressiveness, and I didn't have any healthy outlets because I just thought I don't have the time, or it's something that I constantly said when I'm done with X, Y, Z, and then I'll think about taking care of myself, which we know never happens. The old sort of play hard, work hard, play hard attitude, where the play never comes. So that was my experience with it. I I was really stressed. I was very anxious. I felt overwhelmed. I felt there was no way out. I shared my experience and my story with my wife, and we both sort of decided that something needs to be done. So I opted into therapy, and then subsequently to a program that wasn't necessarily burnout focused, but was more centered around self-awareness. And we'll talk more about that, obviously, as we go on,
Yeah.
about how important self-awareness is when it comes to burnout. So that's been my experience. And nowadays, I help leaders avoid that whole cycle through preventative measures and personalized plans to be able to identify the early signs and the triggers, or through self-management.
Yeah. Do you think, and this is something I've talked to other men about, because there are differences with men and women. Do you think typically a male's value is tied to a paycheck?
I think that's a very sort of common possibility and theme. I mean, talking about both myself and my clients, the masculinity subject around sort
Mhm.
of it sort of goes into comparison. It goes into seeing worth and value compared to materialistic means, career, your house, your car, and that sort of thing. It's a very common thing that I see, and men traditionally have this responsibility or feel they've got this responsibility. Like myself, I got married pretty young, and I was very sort of responsible for that. So
Yeah.
my family, my wife, and it brought on the thinking that I need to do whatever's possible to support, provide, and if I'm not doing it, that's a weakness, and that's on me. And I need to fix it, and I need to fix it by myself and alone. And
Yeah.
that's another big reason why men go through that experience and that phase.
Yeah. And on one hand, there is an aspect to where men are the providers. I mean, that's biological, right? Um, but I could understand and empathize if I was a man, like how that would feel, especially when you're transitioning from being taken care of by your parents and then you're 18, 19, 20, in that phase, and you feel like, okay, I have to get all the money, I have to do all the things to really be a man, right? Like you don't give yourself any time to take a break. You don't give yourself time to figure out who you are or introspect because you're so focused on my value is tied to this money and I have to go get this money.
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%.
Yeah.
I think nowadays it's probably, I would say, fortunately, that mindset and that traditional way of thinking is shifting a lot.
Hmm.
But I just feel that there is still a lot to be done when it comes to areas such as vulnerability,
Hmm.
redefining masculinity, what that truly is, and asking for help and support, which is something that still a lot of individuals struggle to do with because they tie that back into it being a weakness rather than it's being courageous or a strength. So absolutely, I agree with that.
Yeah. Even taking a break, that's such a feminine concept, right? Like I personally feel like one of the ways I prevent burnout is through being able to fully detach and take breaks. Like no phone on, go do what I need to do, completely rest. There's a saying, actually my father used to say it, el bel far niente, like the art of doing nothing. And I have no problem incorporating that into my life. And truly, I never did. I didn't ever have a problem being like, okay, no, I need rest. But with men, it's just, it's again, it's that feminine, masculine energy thing. It's not as ingrained. And maybe they, as a collective, don't feel they have permission to just take a break. Maybe that to them is a little bit of laziness.
Yeah, it could be. And there are characters that I think we can all relate to in our lives at this moment in time where um, they can't sit still, is the easy way to put it. They have to
Yeah.
constantly be busy doing something, either sort of around the house or outside. And I like it from a productivity sense of view, but it's like anything else. Too much of something is indeed bad for you. So if that's causing you to, if it's negatively impacting your health, then that's something that you need to look at. And I think that's where self-awareness sort of comes into it quite a lot. How about yourself, Chelsea? What's your story with burnout?
Yeah. So my story is a little similar. We both share the commonality of starting our careers young. So at the age of 18, somehow somebody saw something in me and also made me a sales manager. I was a sales manager of a fitness center in Georgia. And then throughout my college career, because I did go to school to study finance, I worked and I started doing door to door sales. So I always was making money. I was always had different side hustles going on. At that time, when I was in college, I was always like bartending, even with ADP, like I was bartending or I was doing promotions. I was cleaning houses. I started a house cleaning business. There was always this high focus on making money, mainly because I needed it. Nobody else was paying my bills, so I needed to make money. And in my senior year of college, I became really sick and my whole world got flipped upside down. I started having difficulty with seeing the chalkboard, which was never a problem for me. Like I always had perfect vision. And I noticed I started having issues where like my legs would buckle. I would get extremely disoriented and dizzy out of nowhere. And I went to different doctors. I ended up at a neurologist, got an MRI, and they saw lesions on my brain, all over my brain. And that's when they said, okay, you have multiple sclerosis. You need to take medication. And I was really resistant. I had celiac disease as a kid. So when I heard this diagnosis, I didn't want to believe it. And I decided that it wasn't true and just that it was my celiacs acting up and I needed to be more diligent with my diet. And for years, I went, into more of a holistic route, really rejecting any type of medication. Um, but the issue for me and the burnout really set in was when I didn't listen to my own limits. So I had physical limits at the time and I didn't want to hear it. So I moved to New York City, got a job in finance, did the whole thing. And I just kept pushing and going and going. And I ran myself physically just into the ground. I ended up in the hospital. And this cycle went on. So I would, get a little bit better. At certain points in my mid 20s, I started trying more medication. Copaxone is a shot I started taking to try to help support my system with the holistic care. And it just still was too much. And trying to navigate having a chronic illness at such a young age while trying to be extremely successful, it was a problem because I couldn't accept reality and I couldn't accept that I had a physical capacity issue that was stopping me from getting to the point that I wanted to be at.
Would you say you were self-aware at that point about this was going on? Did you sort of recognize that a bit later?
No, I recognized it later. I mean, I knew I was sick and I knew that there was definitely, you can't ignore it when you're that sick. Something's going on. But I dove so deeply into diet and blaming diet and thinking I could just meditate and cleanse and just holistically cure my way out of it, which in itself became a full time job. So my health became like a full time job, then having a full time job. And also at that time, I owned the Caddy Girls and a promotional modeling agency. So I I was overworked a bit for the fact that I was sick. If I wasn't sick, it would have been fine because I have a large capacity to get things done, and my focus was on revenue and making money. It wasn't as much on partying and things. Not that I didn't party, partied a little, but it was more on becoming successful. So if I wasn't sick, it would have been fine. But with that element, it really just, yeah, it was a cyclone, tornado of sorts.
Something stood out to me in what you just said, and that was I have a very large capacity for getting things done.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one because dependent on how you sort of measure that, a lot of individuals, that's one of the common sort of misconceptions that people could have, because if you're not listening to your mind, if you're not listening to your body, if you're not listening to some of the signals, or you're not trigger managing, let's say, we all sort of have this tendency to feel like it doesn't affect us. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why people burn out, because we think we're built differently. That's one of the common reasons I find in individuals who burn out, because they don't feel like it could affect them, but then they usually find out when it's too late and it's done. And I can
Yeah.
certainly relate to that. That was my personal experience. That was it. You sort of get accustomed to thinking that consistently maintaining a high level of stress is normal, because you feel like that's what you're paid to do. That's why you're accountable for. And in the more sort of traditional sense of certain business models, like the one that I was very used to, where there was daily targets, there's daily revenue targets to meet. Every day of the job is very high stress and high pressured. Then you've got a team to manage as well.
Yeah.
So I think, not to say that that there are certain industries that through research are sort of more prone to burnout, especially sort of industries such as hospitals,
Hmm.
fire departments, and places where police departments, for example, those are sort of classed as the dangerous jobs as well. So that we'll put that to one side. But I think for me, it's always been the second category would be companies who are the business model is designed in a way where there's just elevated stress and pressure every day to achieve certain financial metrics.
Yeah.
Whereas other companies who've got a longer sort of waiting time or a scope to be able to say either product develop or project manage or that sort of thing, those are less prone statistically. Whereas again, it goes back to the individual, and that's what I wanted to sort of discuss next. So we've got this list and this set of common signs of burnout, or symptoms, let's say, and those are stuff like emotional exhaustion, where we just feel drained all the time. We're overwhelmed by even the littlest things. I remember a time in work when I did the smallest tasks or the smallest requests would either get me very sort of worked up. I would be very negative, or I would just feel like I was very tired
Yeah.
and overwhelmed, even though it could be on the surface, it may not have been something significant, but it was enough to push me over the edge. And that's one of the most common signs of and symptoms of burnout. So we've got emotional exhaustion, we've got cynicism and detachment, and that sort of relates to what I said about feeling negative or detached from people at work, especially in a leadership position, as you can appreciate, where we often talk about the leadership position as a very low position, especially
Yeah.
the more senior you get. So you've already got this sort of feeling of a detachment from people around you. And then when you add the symptoms of burnout to it, that sort of makes it double. And the effects are twofold. We've got the physical symptoms, which are experiencing fatigue. A lot of individuals go through sort of headaches, insomnia. Insomnia is one that I had. I couldn't sleep at that point, and other health problems that are related to stress. And then we've got behavioral changes, which is an interesting one because it's normally not self-perceived. It could be through external self-awareness, where people are constantly telling you, for example, your partner's telling you, your friends are telling you, your colleagues are telling you that there's something up, like your productivity is either dipping, or you're making the wrong decisions one after the other. You're irritable, you're impatient and aggressive, which is three symptoms that I went through personally at the time. So these are the common signs of symptoms, and then we've got other, I would say, organizationally focused symptoms more, where it's misalignment of values. The job you do, it doesn't bring you value. It doesn't you're not aligned with it. You don't enjoy it. You work in a toxic culture where you don't feel valued, you don't feel heard, you don't feel appreciated. You could have issues with the leadership team. You could be micromanaged. You could be isolated, even though you're working in a team environment, and you feel like you're very different, and you don't fit in to the culture, for example. And these are more organizationally specific symptoms. Have you got anything to add to that, Chelsea? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the self-awareness piece is super important. You have to know your baseline. You need to know who you are, so when there is something up, you feel it. And sometimes that's in self-awareness, just to say exactly what it is, it's just being able to understand and know your mind and your body. To me, that's what it means. And when you are self-aware, you're connected to your own needs, and you're connected to how you show up in the world, and you show up in relationships, and you show up in work. So when something is amiss and there's a repeat pattern, you start to see it. Like if you keep getting headaches and that's not common for you, okay, that's a symptom. Or if you have anxiety, or something, insomnia, you're staying up at night, and that's not your baseline, that's not common, that'll be a red flag for you. But if you lack self-awareness and you've never spent time introspecting and connecting to yourself and your internal guidance system, that's a hard thing to know, and that's a hard thing to do when you're that disconnected. I see it all the time. Like even with like, I've seen it a lot with women too. Like from a young age, we suppressed our appetite, because back in my day, in my generation, we were told to be skinny, and it's something so small, like they just won't eat, or they won't know that they're hungry at work, but they're starting to get fuzzy mentally. They aren't, I'm talking throughout the day, like they won't eat. They won't realize that they're hungry. And I've done this too, because I detached from my internal guidance system and suppressed my own hunger. And then during the day, I'd be like, why am I so tired? Like, why can't I get this done? Like, it was like, you just need to eat a meal. Sometimes it's something as small as like, you just need to eat, right? But if you're detaching yourself, it gets hard.
I think, yeah. And I think, I mean, we're bordering on sort of self-awareness and well-being.
Yeah.
And I think that's a common thing that I see a lot, where, let's be honest, I mean, it's easy enough telling someone, let's just go and be self-aware. It is difficult, because A, there needs to be the right intent and willingness to be able to do that. And B, a lot of individuals don't know where to start. They don't know what that means. That we all have the definition. We all have different definitions of it, which is interesting as well. For me, it's always been the ability, and for me, it's always come under the emotional intelligence umbrella. It's always part of this bigger system, where self-awareness is sort of your ability to recognize and understand your emotions, your feelings, and your behaviors, and how they affect both yourself and others. So I think everyone is, to a point, self-aware, but I think it's not focused, particularly where you use it as a basis to be able to improve or change or grow. So I think it's common for people to say they're self-aware. And this is interesting, because I was reading a study a few months ago about leaders in particular, and the study was done to say that I think 78% or 80% of leaders, when they were asked a question about being self-aware, they said yes. But then when they put them through the evaluation process, because there's various obviously tools and resources to be able to measure that, it ended up with something like 15%.
That makes
And that is
sense.
a, yeah,
Based
it
on
does
my
make sense.
experience, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's thinking you're self-aware is one thing, but really actually putting it into action and putting it into practice is another thing. So on the self-awareness subject, it's very important because it really helps with early detection. It helps with identifying the triggers, because that's part and parcel of self-awareness, is being able to understand and acknowledge what is it that triggers you. And then what we typically do is sort of develop certain coping mechanisms for triggers. So we've got this whole process, the trigger management process, where we acknowledge and recognize a trigger, and then we look at how we can develop coping mechanisms. And this is done naturally because our coping mechanisms usually are also avoidance, procrastination, and that's something that we can naturally do. I mean, I've done that myself previously. It doesn't work because all it's doing is it's band-aiding the situation. It's not healing the wound. So being self-aware and putting it in practice means taking small, daily, tangible steps that result in a positive outcome, where you're able to make informed decisions about your well-being, make informed decisions about your workload, about how it's affecting you, and things like that. So some of the sort of practices that I often share and still do is journaling, for example. If you spend a couple of minutes a day, and this is in particular for individuals who I find they're more resistant to be able to put the self-awareness issue topic in practice because they just don't know where to start. So I would say, as a good starting point, for example, is if you were just spending a couple of minutes, up to 5 minutes, writing down your thoughts, writing down what you're thinking about, writing down instances throughout the day where something really annoyed you, something really sort of pissed you off, it made you aggressive, and it's not about solving the problem. It's just at this point, it's just about writing it and getting it out. And then mindfulness as well, where you're paying attention on trying to pay attention to the present moment, where you're observing your emotions. Again, this could be more complex for certain individuals who are just starting out on the process. But over time, we sort of practice mindfulness where they're able to sit in their emotions without judgment, sit with their thoughts without judgment. And then again, it's not about finding a solution at that point. It's just more about reflection. And feedback is a big one. I know we talked about how resistant some people are when it comes to feedback. I know I was. If someone came over to me in the work setting and said, you made a bad decision, I would get very defensive because I would think I'm the leader. Do you know what I mean? This is my job. Why are you questioning me? That sort of thing. And those are the signs, and those are some of the things that you need to think about why, and if they become consistent patterns, you need to sort of think about why they're consistent and why it's happening. What are your thoughts on that?
So if I was going to give someone advice who's just starting out on an introspective journey, I would say anytime they get triggered about anything, work-wise, personal relationship-wise, get curious. Because no matter what someone else is doing or saying, you're responsible for your own reactivity and your own inner state. So to me, it would be get really curious about, okay, I'm feeling angry, real life example. I was working with a client last year, and they started to get into this cycle that mimicked my relationship cycle with my ex, to be honest with you. It was almost like love bombing and then devaluation, right? It was like, Chelsea's the best. And then like, Chelsea, you're an idiot. So when they would go through the devaluation, I was curious. I got curious, like, okay, what did they actually say? Why am I feeling devalued? Where is this coming from? Is it me? Not so much projecting it out on this one's an asshole or this one did this, right? Like what's happening internally. And, over a period of time in noticing patterns and behaviors and the passive aggressiveness, I was able to come from a really solid, logical place, not guided by my emotions, to be like, hey, this dynamic isn't working for me. And then I ended the contract. So if you, and that's where it's like it's important to be connected to oneself, because then you can make decisions other that stop the burnout. Otherwise I would have gotten completely burned out, because I would have been emotionally tormented for who knows how long, and I had already been subjecting myself to it for a little while anyway. But I think it's that curiosity. Same with the hunger. Okay, all of a sudden it's really hard for me to focus and get this Excel sheet done. The math isn't mathing. What's happening? And then get curious, like what potentially could be going on? Because if you know you're a competent person and something's not getting done, maybe, what is it? Okay, maybe I'm just hungry. Getting curious is the first step. And being open, right? Not projecting outward and putting the blame on everyone else, but always getting curious what's happening internally, dissecting those things and sitting in silence and figuring it out. You don't have to be a guru or like some meditative genius to do it. You don't have to be a monk. You just need to be curious.
No, absolutely. I like that addition, because leaning into curiosity and growth is something that, and learning is something that we should be doing anyway. And I think, especially when it comes to, um, from an occupational sense of point of view, it's something that we should be doing anyway. So leaning into curiosity is a big thing. I think one thing that could sort of, I know this happened to me, for example, was regardless of how I tried to manage the situation internally in my own mind, I was very quick to point the finger and shift blame, for example, to my parents, to people around me at the time, to my boss. And it's just something common that your first point of call could be, right, is life's unfair, this is unfair, I'm being treated unfairly. And I use a term quite often, which is removing the fiction from the fact. And this is one of the reasons why I encourage writing stuff down and journaling and bringing out on paper, because it really helps when you read your own writing and read what you've written. It's one of those where you could, when you read it back, you do sort of think you've got an opportunity, you've got a few moments to think that, is this factual, is this non-factual, or even that could become an exercise. You can write a list, you can write bullet points, and then think how much of this is factual and how much of it is something that I'm making it up, how much of this is fiction. And that in itself, I found it could really help alleviate a lot of the pressure and stress once we bring it out. So those two areas, where it's shifting blame or becoming the victim, it doesn't help. I'm not saying to disregard that, because if you feel like a victim by any sort of metric or measure, you do feel as a victim, you do feel like a victim. So that's not to say you're not a victim, but it's to say that victimization in this sort of subject doesn't really help. It doesn't help you grow. It just sends you further down. So we've talked about self-awareness. Let's talk a bit about well-being, and what that looks like. So how would you define that if you were to sort of suggest or give a recommendation to someone that's experiencing those symptoms? How would you start them off in terms of well-being? What would be your suggestions?
I don't think that's something that can be just generalized. And I think that's where this whole industry gets into trouble. Even mental health, professionals. It's going to be very specific to the person, because even going back to that victim thing, well, what if someone actually is a victim? What if someone's being domestically abused at home? Right? Like there are times where someone actually is truly a victim, and then someone's just a whiny person with the smallest violin. So it depends. It really does. There's going to be situations where they're blessed like me, and they can just end a contract and say, I'm not doing this, because they're financially secure enough to do that. There's other times where they are not able to do that. They have to stay in that exact same situation, and until they have another revenue source, that's it for them, because that's based on their survival. So to me, it's very much dependent on where somebody is. But overall well-being starts in your own mind, and that's why going back to getting curious, figuring out how to have peace within your own system, your own brain. If you're dealing with illness, this is a huge one. It's really hard to be at peace when you're physically being tormented by your own body every single day. And personally, I was opposed to medication for so long. And not saying medicine's perfect for everybody, but that limiting belief held me back from a quality of life. So maybe it's getting somebody's health in order. Maybe somebody has type 2 diabetes and they just don't want to take the medicine, but they really need to so they could feel better and then they can perform, right? So it depends on the person. It's so situational that I don't know. I just don't think, I mean, there's this general foo-foo advice, right? Like take baths and do yoga and go for a walk and make sure when you take a break, it's a real break and know boundaries and know your limits. But well, what does that actually mean to someone?
Yeah, I agree, but I think I mean, the general advice is certainly there.
Yeah.
Personalization is massive because without it, it's not going to convince someone, let's put it that way, to actually take action, because the first thought that springs to mind is, well, that doesn't apply to me. Like
Mm.
I was writing something about, or I was responding to a post about walking in nature, and I was saying that, like, I'm blessed to be in a location, for example, right now where I can leave the house and I've got the sea on one side and the jungle on the other side, or the woods
Oh
on the
my
other side.
goodness, where are
Okay.
you?
But and then someone responded and said, it takes me 2 hours to get to somewhere where I can walk in nature. And it's like, okay,
Same.
that's perfect.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So yeah, it's understandable. So that's where personalization does come in. The way I see it, though, is as long as we're striving, and this is something that helped me massively in my own sort of personal recovery and healing journey, as long as we're striving to do something for our physical, mental, emotional, social, and spiritual health daily, regardless of how that is, what you do, how long it takes, if we strive to do something that helps us in those sort of 5 areas, to me, that's well-being, and it's a good start. And that
Yeah.
could be exercise, it could
Yeah.
be meditation, it could be yoga, it could be walks. From a physical point of view, socially, I think everyone knows what we mean by that. Spiritually, I'm not going to delve into whether you're religious or spiritual. Engaging in these activities can help sort of you be grounded a lot of the times. I know it helps me. It helps me sort of enjoy the simpler things of life, because life can get very complicated if we let it in our minds. And I think if we do something for those 5 areas a day, depending on how that translates to you, to me, that's a very good preventative measure for burnout. And it also helps massively with self-awareness, because it helps you gain clarity, it helps you focus. And like you said, if you're listening to your body, if you're listening to your mind, and then sometimes the littlest tasks and the actions could really help, and it could be a simple solution sometimes, and there's no point over complicating that. What do you
Yeah.
think?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think there's the obvious ones, right? Like we know that exercise is important. Diet to me is everything, it always has been. Sleep. I think sleep is kind of underrated. I sleep a lot. I really do. Sometimes I need 9, 10 hours of sleep and I give it to myself. The other thing is, and I've spoken to you about this, as a woman specifically, it's really important to know your menstrual cycle. And for me, I like to sync my work calendar with my menstrual cycle. So, men, you guys run on a 24-hour hormonal cycle. You could do the same thing every single day, productivity wise. It's like Groundhog's Day for you. And that's where that Monday through Friday structure really came from, in that 9 to 5 and those long hours. But for women, we run on typically like a 28-day cycle. So we're fluctuating through phases throughout that 28-day period. And certain times, like the week before our period, which is called the follicular phase, I'm sorry, the luteal phase, right before our period, we can't take on physically as much stress, and mentally we have higher levels of progesterone. We're more susceptible to stress. It just gets to be a lot for us. So that week before my period, the first few days of my period, I actually block my calendar and I don't take on as many discovery calls, as many meetings. I try not to commit to any hard proposal deadlines, things like that, because I try to work with, not against my hormones. And that has been, I will swear, like the number one game changer outside of getting healthy, and getting, I was misdiagnosed. Well, not, I do have MS, but I was underdiagnosed. I have other health conditions, that went underdiagnosed until I was about 33. So I spent well over like 20 years being underdiagnosed. And once I got a clear diagnosis and then doing that, it was, I feel like superwoman. I could take on pretty much anything. And I will say I am a single mom. I have two girls under the age of 9. So I have a lot on my plate, and I run a business, I'm fractional. I still work full time for an agency as well. So there's a lot going on. But why I say I could take on a lot is because I actually can. As long as I do these things and continue to live the life I'm living, I've been pretty much okay doing this. And also, being mindful of like who I attract as a client, being mindful of who I let into my life, not having any energy vampires, all those things have helped. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's it. Like, it's like knowing you, but that's again, that's different. That's different than it would be for someone who isn't sick. And that would be different for a man, right? It's like different advice.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've covered a lot to do with personal sort of development, and I appreciate you adding those insights, by the way, because that's something I know we
Yeah.
talked about before, but it's something that I don't know if the audience really knew. I certainly didn't know until you told me. So it does differ. Um, I think what let's shift our focus a bit to the organizational setting,
Mm,
because we've sort of covered self-awareness, we've covered well-being to a certain extent, where individuals can participate in certain activities, do certain rituals, do certain things every day when it comes. Let's talk about that person who is in an organization, who's at work, who's very sort of overwhelmed with the job, who feels like they're being micromanaged, for example, they work in a toxic culture. What would your advice be to that person straight away?
I'm a fan of a side hustle. I've always
Okay.
had one. I would say get your side hustle going so you have a diversified revenue stream coming in for yourself, an income stream. Also, start finding another job. But you know what? The grass isn't always greener, just so you know. So sometimes it's greener where you water it. Sometimes it's that bad where you just have to go. And that's where that introspection comes in. You really have to figure it out, right? Because no one could ultimately make that decision but you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some of the things I sort of suggest or I see is there's misconceptions about I shouldn't tell anyone that I'm going through this.
At work.
I at work I shouldn't.
That's not necessarily a misconception in my experience.
No, I mean it's something that individuals feel like it would be either a sign of weakness
Yeah,
or
it is.
it would be to say that um, if I, for example, if I enjoy the job that I'm doing,
Mhm.
regardless of the workload and the stress and the pressure, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
Burnout doesn't apply to me.
But do you think
Uh,
leadership actually respects when someone has weakness?
I would say you'd be surprised
Okay.
about seeking for support and asking for help. Oftentimes, um, this it may feel initially like this is the wrong thing to do, but in my experience or in my experience with clients, when they go and ask for that sort of support, they are pleasantly surprised a lot of the times. A lot of the times they're not, because let's be honest, if you're getting micromanaged, if you're working in a toxic culture, if the organization doesn't value you, for example, which happens very often, then the chances are that conversation is not going to end well, or you're not going to come away from it thinking that you've actually gained something or achieved something. Whereas I would always recommend giving it a try,
Hmm.
because there's various resources that organizations can point you towards. There's various things they can do for you. There's various things that your manager could do for you. Where when you express your concerns and needs, a potential solution can come up where they can, for example, reduce your workload, delegate your workload, even if it's temporarily, because it's not going to be, it may not be a long-term change that's required. It may just be a temporary fix rather than you finding your coping mechanisms, which are typically unhealthy. This could be more of a practical solution where when you ask for that support and help. And at the end of the day, I've always found that when you share something, it takes the pressure off because you're not there to suffer in silence, because your job, regardless of what it is never worth your health. It's never worth putting your mental health and your physical health on the line for a job. So at least I would say try. And if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't work out, then that could give you the motivation to either seek another job or leave that culture, or like you say, start on your side hustle and start thinking about what you value more and start working on that. Because as bad as it sounds, unfortunately, there is still that prevalent belief that burnout is good in terms of saying that I'm working hard enough and I'm working so hard that I can burn out, and that's seen like as an accomplishment, as bad as that sounds. Whereas coming from someone who's burnt out and burnt out massively, it definitely isn't. It certainly isn't, and it's certainly not worth it for any type of job or any job out there. What do you think?
You know, I didn't go, so I never experienced going to somebody with burnout. But what I did experience is going to corporate, JP Morgan specifically, with having multiple sclerosis. And the response was not good. Like, I had to take a medical leave and then come back. And when I came back, there was rumors about me with management that I had either a drug addiction or an eating disorder, even though I shared with everybody, you know, all the medical documentation. It was a challenge to try to get my role back and where they were going to put me. And this is what, like, very early, I was like 23. So no, I don't know if that's the best thing. I mean, it depends on the culture. It depends when. This is also years and years ago. I think I would hope things have changed over 15 years. But I can say I'm not alone because I've spoken to a lot of people with chronic illness or people who've gone through serious diagnoses at work, and it's deeply impacted their careers. And those companies were not there for them. It's even going back to like being a mother, right? Like when I was on maternity leave, I was on maternity leave with my second daughter for like 2 months. And then I had to go right back into work. I didn't get paid for that because I'd switched and I hadn't been with that corporation for long enough. And with my first daughter, she had hip dysplasia, and I would have needed extra time, but there was no fight. There was no way to keep the job to stay with her to go do the PT and stuff. So like, I just don't think that corporations are set up for people who have real challenges or, who are mothers, who have physical limitations. I still don't think they're as inclusive as they claim to be. That's just been, what I've experienced on a personal level, but also people have come to me because I've shared my journey. They've come to me with their journey and I've heard it and I've been like, not so happy with what I've heard.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and let this be sort of serve as a warning then to organizations, because individuals won't stay in cultures which treats them that way, and they often feel like sometimes these stories or these experiences are a way to sort of get an employee out even.
Yeah.
I know I've worked in organizations where that's been the case.
Yeah.
Simply because they're either too lazy, they don't want to manage it, they can't deal with the hassle or the drama, as they call it sometimes. Whereas in reality, even from a financial point of view, we know that recruitment and replacing that individual could cost them a lot more money, and it does cost a lot more money to do that. So they need to work. They need to be smarter and wiser when it comes to making those decisions, because these are the practical aspects of having a healthy culture. Because we talk about culture a lot, a lot of organizations claim to have a really good culture set up.
Yeah.
But in reality, like you say, they're not ready, they're not prepared, they don't know how, or they see it as an excuse to get rid of an employee, which is the worst in my opinion.
Same. I had an employee who was giving me hell for a little while. I've been on the opposite end of this as a leader, but I knew the woman was recently going through a divorce. It was summer. She didn't have the proper childcare set up for her kids, and it wasn't easy. But again, I know that things take time. I also know how much it costs to hire and train somebody new. I really didn't want to go through that. I didn't want my team to go through that. And I stuck it out with them for 2 months. Realistically, in 2 months in a 5-year career, 10-year career, how much is that percentage wise? It's like nothing. And she figured it out. I mean, it wasn't perfect. Those 2 months were really rough. I was triggered and annoyed, but we got through it. And then the next summer came and she had it figured out. So I think, like you're saying, like, yeah, leaders too, they need to be responsible for the people that they hire. And those people chose you to work with you under your leadership. And you have to help them navigate life too, because work and life aren't really separate. You are always bringing both in. So as a leader, you really need to be there for your employees. You need to be an actual leader, not just have that title. You need to lead with empathy, with wisdom, right? Like the way I would mother is the way I would lead a team. It's the same thing.
Let that be a call to action then to any leaders listening in or watching. To it always amazes me when I'm reminded of the fact that there's a lot of resources out there and a lot of posts we also see on LinkedIn about this, where a leader's influence and impact on a team member, if it's a negative impact, it's akin to symptoms of depression, and that scares me. Because being in a leadership position, you have to be very careful about your words, your actions, your behaviors, and how you manage your team.
Yeah.
Because I know I wouldn't ever want that on my shoulders to think like a team member of mine leaves the job at 5 o'clock, for example, and goes home and carries symptoms of depression from work, and that then trickles into their life. And that is something that leaders need to be very, very mindful of. And open their mind beyond the processes, the tasks, the actions that are business related, and take a more holistic approach and a holistic view to what leadership really is. So your experience there is an important one, and let that serve as a call to action. So we've sort of discussed self-awareness, we've discussed the symptoms of burnout, we've discussed some of the tips and offered some tips, shared our personal stories of how we went through sort of burnout. I think at this point, should we do questions? Can we do questions, or
I don't
should
think
we
we can,
summarize?
unfortunately. I mean, we could try, we could give it a
Okay.
minute. But I want to throw in there, this is why I think leadership training is so important. So I've gone through leadership training. You do leadership training. I think if you are going to be in a position as a leader, no matter how small or big your team is, you need to be trained. Because there's just too many people who, even like us in the beginning, you're good at your job, so they just promote you. You don't really know how to lead a team. Those are different things. Those are two different things. And then also, if you're going to start your own business and be an entrepreneur, you need to know how to lead a team through empathy, with an open heart, with boundaries, but again, with an open heart, right? So navigating that takes somebody like you, takes a coach, takes a mastermind group, something. Do something if you're a leader, please. I don't know if we have any questions. I see some comments, but let me see if I can check LinkedIn. I have my computer too. You're running a group, right, Saeed, soon?
I'm not running a group. I'm running a test product, let's say, soon, which is related to leadership. But I'm still in the process of developing that. Now, there's a statement I've been sort of wanting to make, and I think it's it relates to how you prioritize your well-being and self-awareness, and how it could help
Yeah.
prevent burnout. Because I think when we talk about well-being, it's such a general topic, it's such a general subject, whereas in reality, it's like the areas we identified. It's like you said about listening to your body, mind, and taking care. And I think when you do that, you're healthier, you're happier, you feel more fulfilled, you can perform better, you can achieve more, you can enjoy more, and that subsequently means you can, as a leader, you can contribute more to your team, your organization, and even as a team member, that's the same. And then we extend that to the community aspect. One of the things I really sort of recommend people do, again, there's time constraints, I understand that, but is to volunteer in communities, do voluntary work. And the response I normally get is, that was much better than we expected, because I think people are initially sort of, they shy away from doing that. They may feel a bit awkward going into voluntary work, because some of it could be really full on in your face. I understand that, but at the end of the day, that social element of it and that connection it brings to the community and the people around you, I think it's a healthy outlet in terms of the long lasting positive experience, rather than the instant dopamine hit gratification that we look more and more for, unfortunately, these days. Whereas that is the community service, for example, or voluntary work, provides you with a more lasting positive impact, I would say, and a lasting legacy. So my personal journey, my experiences, both in a personal and professional capacity, has sort of brought me to where I am today when it comes to the mission that I have, which is harmonizing your personal and work life. And like you said, work and life aren't separate; they're part of the same cycle and circle. Um, the more you're able to align, the more you're able to create harmony between the two, the more fulfilled and satisfied you will feel, the more you will feel like you're in control, the more self aware you would be, the more mindful you would be. Um, and for that reason, it's um, it's what I do today, and it's what I help leaders do in their lives. Um, how can individuals reach you, Chelsea?
So for me, and this is, obviously not my area of expertise, just my lived experience. People can reach out to me on LinkedIn if they need help with scaling their companies. But for you, Saeed, do you want to just share a little bit about how you support individuals and companies?
Sure. I mean, I do my sort of experience since becoming a management consultant, senior management consultant, was predominantly to do with organizational culture, because I feel like that is the basis and foundation of everything else to happen. Um, and it's interesting because a lot about well-being and self-care and personal development comes into that as well. Um, I then consistently got approached about doing sort of leadership coaching on a one-to-one basis. So I transitioned. I still do accept organizational work, but I'm more focused on the individual, because I think when you want to take an individual on a bit of a journey of self-discovery and recovery, it's better done in an individual and one-to-one setting. So right now I use sort of personalized coaching and leadership development and personal development approach to help leaders self-manage, to help them become more self-aware, to help them elevate their leadership skills and well-being at the same time. And the result of that is the whole harmonizing your work and life to feel more fulfilled, satisfied, and be able to be more productive at the same time. So that's
Yeah.
my current mission. If anyone wants to reach me, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, send me a message. There's a link there to schedule a call if you'd like to do that, a 30-minute non-obligational call. You can do that as well. And yeah,
Perfect.
so shall we end with some comments or?
It doesn't, we don't have anything really.
Okay.
So the thing I do want to call out too, I think it is so important to have that individual prescription. Not that you're giving medical advice, but that individual program tailored to what's going on in your life, because everybody's life is unique and everyone's story is unique, from inception and childhood trauma and their their, adult life, everything's different for everyone. And that's why I really like what you do, because it's individual. It's focused on one person. It's not just this generic advice, right? That it's like, yeah, we all know that, but how do you put that into action? How do you get somebody going to take that walk? How do you get somebody to eat a little bit better? And that's where someone like you comes in. So I just love the work you do. I think it's magic. And if you guys have questions, you can connect with us, send DMs. But yeah, there's nothing inside of this live.
Sure.
The way LinkedIn works is a little bit different than the other live platforms, unfortunately.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on that note, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today and being part of this discussion. I've enjoyed it very much. I've enjoyed learning more about you, Chelsea, and your story.
Yes, me too.
And we're just grateful for your interest and engagement and appreciate any feedback or questions that you have. So everyone have a wonderful day, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Yes, thanks, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, Saieed.
Bye.